Have you ever heard of Willie Harold, a mere 19-year-old corporal who masqueraded as a German captain and perpetrated a chilling massacre during World War II's final days? It's a tale that straddles the line between audacious impersonation and grim history, raising questions about identity, power, and the depths of human behavior in times of chaos. Let's delve into the unlikely story of Harold, whose actions left an indelible mark on the annals of wartime history. The Unlikely Impersonator, Willie Harold's early life and military service. Picture a small town in Saxony, Germany, where a young boy named Willie Paul Harold was born on September 11, 1925. Growing up in Lunzenau, Harold's life was initially unremarkable, marked by the typical routines of school and family life. He attended primary school in the nearby town of Chemnitz, a regular kid in a country on the brink of monumental changes. As Harold entered his teenage years, the landscape of Germany was transforming under the Nazi regime. Like many young Germans, Harold was swept up in the wave of nationalism. He joined the Hitler Youth, the Deutsches Jungvolk, embracing the vigorous propaganda and the promise of belonging to something larger than himself. However, Harold's journey in the Hitler Youth was not a smooth one. His undisciplined nature led to his expulsion in 1936, a setback that marked the beginning of a turbulent path. The life of a chimney sweep awaited Harold after his expulsion, a humble and sooty profession far removed from the grandeur and discipline of military life. Yet, this detour was short-lived. As World War II engulfed Europe, Harold, now 18, was called up to the ranks of the German army in 1943. His destination, the Paratrooper Division. Despite his earlier disciplinary issues, Harold demonstrated bravery and resilience, qualities that would later manifest in more sinister ways. Harold's military journey took him to the Italian front, a theater of war marked by fierce battles and relentless challenges. He fought in Salerno, Nettuno, and the infamous Battle of Monte Cassino. These experiences no doubt shaped the young soldier, hardening him and immersing him in the brutal realities of war. However, Harold's story took a dramatic turn in March 1945. As the war neared its end, with Germany's defeat looming, the dynamics on the battlefields were chaotic and desperate. During a chaotic retreat near Gronau, on the border with the Netherlands, Harold became separated from his unit. Lost and alone, his journey took a fateful twist. It was in this period of confusion and desperation that Harold stumbled upon an abandoned Luftwaffe vehicle. Inside, he discovered the uniform of a Luftwaffe captain, complete with prestigious decorations like the first-class Iron Cross. This discovery was a turning point for Harold. Fascinated by the uniform and perhaps recognizing an opportunity, he decided to don the attire, stepping into a role far beyond his rank and experience. The decision to wear the captain's uniform was, in part, a survival strategy. In the disarray of the war's final days, deserters were dealt with harshly, often facing immediate execution. By assuming the identity of a higher-ranking officer, Harold could avoid suspicion and the dire consequences of being labeled a deserter. But Harold's actions went beyond mere self-preservation. With the captain's uniform came a sense of power and authority. Harold began to recruit other lost soldiers he encountered, forming an ad hoc unit. These men, deserters and stragglers themselves, were drawn to Harold's newfound authority. In a short time, Harold, the corporal turned captain, had assembled a makeshift force of about 30 men, even commanding an anti-aircraft cannon. The transformation from a disciplined but ordinary soldier to an imposter commanding his own unit was rapid and astonishing. In the chaos of war, where rules and structures were crumbling, Harold found a way to exploit the situation to his advantage. His journey from the humble beginnings in Lunzenau to a self-made officer on the German front lines was as improbable as it was ominous. As we follow Harold's trajectory, it becomes clear that his story is more than just a tale of impersonation. It is a glimpse into the human capacity for adaptation, deception, and, as we will see, unspeakable cruelty. Harold's early life and military service set the stage for the dark chapter that was to follow at the Aschendorfer Moor prison camp. A deceptive disguise, finding the Luftwaffe captain's uniform. In the tumultuous backdrop of World War II, as the Allied forces pressed on, the German army found itself in disarray. It was in this setting of chaos and desperation that Corporal Willie Harold, separated from his unit, embarked on a journey that would dramatically alter the course of his life. The pivotal moment came when Harold stumbled upon an abandoned vehicle belonging to the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. This discovery marked the beginning of a dark chapter, one that would earn him notoriety and a place in the annals of war history. The vehicle, left unattended, perhaps a casualty of the frantic German retreat, was a treasure trove for Harold. Inside, he found a Luftwaffe captain's uniform. This wasn't just any uniform. It was adorned with prestigious insignia, including the first-class Iron Cross, a decoration awarded for bravery. For the 19-year-old Harold, this uniform was not just a piece of clothing. It was a ticket to authority, power, and ultimately, infamy. Harold, in an act of audacious deceit, decided to don the uniform. This decision was more than a mere act of disguise. It was a calculated move to exploit the chaos of war. By impersonating a Luftwaffe captain, Harold could avoid detection as a deserter, a crime punishable by death during these times. But perhaps more intriguingly, it offered him an opportunity to wield power and command, an allure too tempting for the young corporal to resist. With the captain's uniform snugly fitted, Harold transformed. He adopted the persona of a high-ranking officer, a role far removed from his reality as a paratrooper corporal. This transformation was not only physical, but psychological. Harold began to act the part, adopting the mannerisms and authority of a Luftwaffe captain. His disguise was convincing. The uniform lent him an air of legitimacy that was rarely questioned in the militaristic hierarchy of Nazi Germany. The impact of this disguise was immediate and profound. Harold, leveraging his assumed identity, began to gather a band of followers, soldiers who had lost their way, deserters, and those separated from their units. These men, drawn to the authority and confidence that Harold exuded in his captain's guise, became his subordinates. In a short span, Harold had created an ad hoc unit, a makeshift band that operated under his command. The assembly of this unit was a testament to the chaotic environment of the time. Soldiers, desperate for leadership and direction in the collapsing German front, were easily swayed by the appearance of authority. Harold's unit, though ragtag and unofficial, became a functioning group, complete with an anti-aircraft gun, a Flak 30. This powerful weapon, capable of firing 120 rounds per minute, was a significant addition to Harold's improvised arsenal. Harold's transformation was not just a survival tactic, it was an opportunistic power grab. In the lawless environment of the war's final days, the uniform was his shield and his sword. It allowed him to navigate through the chaos, commandeer resources, and most alarmingly, exert control over others. This newfound power was intoxicating to Harold, who had, just months earlier, been an ordinary soldier. The impersonation of a Luftwaffe captain by Willie Harold is a stark reminder of the fine line between order and chaos, especially in times of war. Harold's story is not just one of impersonation, but also of the human propensity to exploit situations for personal gain. It highlights how, in the absence of structured authority and amidst widespread confusion, a uniform and a bold demeanor could grant immense power, even to a young and inexperienced soldier. Harold's journey from a lost corporal to a self-styled captain leading his own unit is a chilling example of how power can be seized and abused. It is a narrative that underscores the fragility of identity and the dangers of unchecked authority. As we delve deeper into Harold's story, we witness the unfolding of a harrowing saga of deception, authority, and the moral abyss into which Harold would plunge. The Aschendorfer Moor prison camp, a turn to darkness. In the heart of a war-torn Germany, a young corporal masquerading as a Luftwaffe captain was about to write one of the darkest chapters in the annals of World War II. This chapter begins on April 12, 1945, as Willi Herold, draped in his deceptive disguise, set foot in the Aschendorfer Moor prison camp, located in the Emsland district of northwestern Germany. Aschendorfer Moor, established in 1935, was a grim facility initially intended for the internment of political dissidents. By 1945, it had morphed into a crowded and chaotic prison camp, teeming with around 2,500 to 3,000 inmates. Most of these prisoners were German soldiers, accused of desertion in the face of the Allies' advance, along with looters and other criminals. The overcrowded conditions, coupled with the tense atmosphere of a Germany on the brink of defeat, created a powder keg of desperation and fear. Into this volatile mix stepped Herold, his uniform lending him an unearned gravitas. He presented himself to the camp authorities with a fabricated story. He was on a mission, ordered directly by Adolf Hitler, to inspect the situation behind the front lines. The chaotic state of the war, with its breakdown of communication and command structures, made Herold's audacious lie seem plausible. The camp officials, perhaps desperate for a semblance of order or simply too overwhelmed to question his authority, accepted his story. Herold quickly seized control of the situation. He declared himself the judge and enforcer of the camp, a self-appointed role that went uncontested. His arrival coincided with a growing discord among the camp's administrators and guards, further exacerbating the turmoil within the camp. Friedrich Hansen, the administrative head, and Karl Schutte, the officer in charge of the SA guards, were already in conflict, struggling to manage the camp's overcrowded and volatile conditions. Herold's intervention was seen as a solution to their problems. With the backing of Schutte, he took over the security operations of the camp, gaining the respect and obedience of the officials and guards. To these men, Herold's uniform and assertive demeanor symbolized authority and decisiveness, qualities desperately needed in the camp's fraught environment. However, Herold's actions were far from the stabilizing force the camp officials had hoped for. Instead, he instituted a reign of terror that would result in one of the most heinous massacres of the war. Herold, exploiting his newfound power, began to organize trials against the prisoners, particularly those accused of desertion. These trials were a farce, lacking any semblance of legal procedure or fairness. Herold and his men acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Under Herold's command, the Kampfgruppe Herold, his makeshift unit of soldiers, carried out brutal and indiscriminate executions. The first of these occurred on April 13th, just a day after Herold's arrival at the camp. The victims were forced to dig their own mass graves before being callously slaughtered. Herold's methods were cruel and barbaric, involving the use of the anti-aircraft gun he had commandeered, as well as hand grenades and small arms fire. The sheer scale of the violence was staggering. In the days following Herold's takeover, scores of prisoners were executed. The exact number remains a subject of historical debate, but estimates suggest that up to 172 inmates lost their lives in these summary executions. These acts of brutality were not just a manifestation of Herold's abuse of power. They were symptomatic of the broader collapse of order and morality in the final days of Nazi Germany. Aschendorfer Moor, under Herold's command, had become a microcosm of the chaos and lawlessness that pervaded the dying days of the Third Reich. The prison camp, once a site of containment and control, had devolved into a theater of cruelty and death. Herold, in his ill-gotten uniform, epitomized the dangers of unbridled power and the ease with which authority could be usurped and misused in times of desperation. The Massacre. Execution of prisoners and the role of Herold. The grim saga of Willi Herold reached its most horrifying chapter at the Aschendorfer Moor prison camp, where a young man's deceit and thirst for power culminated in a massacre that stands as one of the most brutal episodes of World War II's final days. Herold, now masquerading as a Luftwaffe captain, transformed the camp into a stage for his most sinister act, the execution of prisoners. The pretext for the massacre was the restoration of order and discipline in a camp overrun with alleged deserters and criminals. Harold, adopting the role of a ruthless enforcer, saw himself as the arbiter of justice, albeit a twisted and self-serving one. The trials conducted under his supervision were nothing more than a charade, lacking any legal legitimacy. Harold and his makeshift unit, the so-called Kampfgruppe Harold, took on the roles of judge, jury, and executioner. The first of these executions took place on April 13, 1945, a day that would be marked by bloodshed and cruelty. Harold's men rounded up a group of prisoners and forced them to dig a large pit, their own mass grave. Then, with cold efficiency, Harold ordered the use of the Flak 30 anti-aircraft gun they had commandeered. This weapon, designed for warfare, was now turned on defenseless prisoners. The brutality of using such a weapon for executions was unprecedented and shocking. The gun's rapid-fire capability meant that death was not just certain, but also indiscriminate and merciless. The horror did not end there. When the anti-aircraft gun jammed, Harold's men resorted to using hand grenades and small arms. The chaos and cruelty of these moments were unimaginable. Prisoners were torn apart by the explosions, their final moments marked by fear and agony. Harold, far from showing any sign of remorse or hesitation, continued to orchestrate this macabre scene. In the days that followed, the massacre continued. More prisoners were brought to the same fate, forced to dig their graves before being brutally killed. The number of victims continued to rise, with some estimates suggesting that as many as 172 prisoners were killed in these summary executions. Each act of violence further entrenched Harold's role as a perpetrator of atrocities, a far cry from the undisciplined but ordinary soldier he once was. The massacre at Aschendorfer Moor was not just a series of isolated incidents. It was a systematic campaign of terror and murder. Harold's actions were driven by a mix of personal ambition, a warped sense of authority, and perhaps a deep-seated indifference to human life. His transformation from a young corporal to a ruthless executioner reflects the darkest potentials of human nature, especially when unchecked by moral or legal constraints. The role of Harold's men in these events cannot be understated. They followed orders, perhaps out of fear, loyalty, or their own sense of survival. This compliance raises disturbing questions about the nature of obedience and the capacity for ordinary individuals to partake in extraordinary cruelty. The massacre at Aschendorfer Moor is a stark reminder of the ease with which people can be swayed to commit heinous acts under the guise of duty or authority. The tragedy of Aschendorfer Moor lies not only in the loss of life, but also in the moral decay it represented. The camp, a microcosm of the larger war, became a place where the value of human life was utterly disregarded. Harold's massacre was a manifestation of the chaos and brutality that defined the closing chapters of the Third Reich. It serves as a harrowing example of how power, when vested in the wrong hands, can lead to unspeakable horrors. The aftermath, discovery, trial, and reflections. The aftermath of the Aschendorfer Moor massacre unveiled a landscape marred by brutality and tragedy, a stark testament to the horrors that unfolded under Willie Harold's command. As the dust settled and World War II drew to its tumultuous close, the full extent of Harold's actions came to light, leading to his eventual capture, trial, and the subsequent reflections on the atrocities he orchestrated. Following the massacre, Harold and his makeshift unit, drunk on power and impunity, continued their reign of terror across the German countryside. They indulged in a spree of looting, drinking, and random acts of violence, embodying the chaos that gripped the nation in the war's dying days. However, this anarchic freedom was short-lived. On April 28, 1945, as the Allies tightened their grip and the German war machine crumbled, Harold and his men were apprehended by the German military police near Aurich in Lower Saxony. Harold's trial was a spectacle of the post-war reckoning that awaited many who had participated in the war's countless atrocities. During the proceedings, Harold's audacity was on full display. He confessed openly to his impersonation of a Luftwaffe captain and the crimes committed at Aschendorfer Moor. Strikingly, His brazenness and candor during the trial earned him a peculiar form of admiration from the tribunal. They were swayed by his honesty and decided to release him on the condition that he return to the front lines to fight. However, in the chaotic post-war environment, Harold managed to escape. Harold's brief taste of freedom ended on May 23, 1945, when he was arrested by British occupation forces after a petty theft. Once his true identity and the extent of his war crimes were uncovered, he, along with 11 members of his unit, was formally charged with war crimes. The trial that followed was part of a larger effort by the Allies to bring justice to those who had committed unspeakable acts during the war. The trial was meticulous and thorough, with the British forces determined to set a precedent for post-war justice. On February 1, 1946, as part of the investigation, Harold and his men were forced to exhume the bodies of the victims at Aschendorfer Moor. This grim task brought to light the scale of their brutality. 172 bodies were discovered in the mass graves, a silent testimony to the massacre. The outcome of the trial was inevitable. On August 29, 1946, Harold and 6 of his men were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The others were acquitted. The judgment reflected a post-war world grappling with the enormity of the crimes committed during the conflict and the necessity of delivering justice. Harold's execution on November 14, 1946, by guillotine at the Wolfenbüttel prison in Lower Saxony, marked the end of his short but infamous life. His death, however, did little to close the chapter on the horrors he had inflicted. The massacre at Aschendorfer Moor remained a haunting reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink. The story of Willie Harold and the Aschendorfer Moor massacre is a chilling narrative of how power, when wielded without conscience, can lead to horrific outcomes. Harold's ability to deceive, his thirst for authority, and his indifference to human suffering raise unsettling questions about human nature and morality. His transformation from a corporal to an executioner serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of ethical boundaries in times of chaos and war. In reflecting on Harold's actions and their aftermath, one is compelled to ponder the broader implications of his story. It underscores the necessity of vigilance against the corrupting influence of power and the importance of justice in the face of atrocity. Harold's tale is a cautionary one, illustrating the potential for evil that exists when moral constraints are abandoned and authority is seized for malevolent purposes. As history looks back on the massacre at Aschendorfer Moor, it serves not only as a record of a young man's descent into inhumanity, but also as a broader reflection on the darkness that can emerge in times of turmoil and desperation. Harold's story, from the audacious impersonation to the grim executions and the eventual reckoning, remains a powerful testament to the consequences of unbridled power and a reminder of the necessity for justice and moral integrity, even amidst the chaos of war. The psychology of deception and authority, understanding Harold's transformation. In exploring the harrowing saga of Willie Harold, it becomes essential to delve into the psychological underpinnings of his transformation from a mere corporal to a ruthless imposter and executioner. This chapter seeks to understand the factors that may have influenced Harold's actions, providing insight into the complex interplay of deception, authority, and the human psyche in times of extreme stress and chaos. Harold's decision to impersonate a Luftwaffe captain was not a mere act of survival. It was a step into a world of deceit that offered him unexpected power and authority. Psychologically, the act of deception can create a sense of control and superiority, especially in chaotic environments like war. In Harold's case, donning the captain's uniform may have initially been a strategy to evade capture as a deserter. However, the uniform became a mask that not only concealed his true identity, but also empowered him to reinvent himself in a world where the traditional structures of authority were rapidly disintegrating. Once Harold assumed the role of a captain, he found himself in a position of significant power, particularly in the setting of the Aschendorfer Moor prison camp. The psychological impact of such power cannot be understated. Often, power can corrupt, altering one's perceptions and attitudes towards others, For Harold, the power he wielded was intoxicating. It allowed him to command, control, and ultimately, to kill. The Stanford prison experiment, conducted in the 1970s, illustrated how quickly and drastically power can affect behavior and moral judgment, a phenomenon that seems to have been mirrored in Harold's actions. Harold's successful impersonation was facilitated by the unquestioned obedience to authority ingrained in military culture, especially within the ranks of the Nazi regime. This blind adherence to hierarchy, combined with the chaos of the war's final days, created a perfect storm in which Harold's deception could thrive. The Milgram experiment on obedience to authority figures, conducted in the 1960s, highlighted how ordinary people could perform acts against their moral compass under the direction of an authority figure. In Harold's case, he became that authority figure, exploiting others' obedience to command and control. The context of war cannot be overlooked when examining Harold's actions. War often blurs moral lines, making actions that would be inconceivable in peacetime a reality. The constant exposure to violence and death can desensitize individuals, leading to a warped sense of morality. For Harold, the brutality of war likely eroded his ethical boundaries, making the leap to executing prisoners a smaller moral jump than it would have been in a non-war setting. Harold's early life, marked by expulsion from the Hitler Youth and a lack of direction, suggests a young man in search of identity and belonging. The military provided a sense of purpose and structure, albeit in a perverse form. When he donned the captain's uniform, Harold not only assumed a new identity, but also fulfilled a deep-seated need for recognition and respect, something he may have felt deprived of in his earlier life. Finally, Harold's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the necessity of moral and legal constraints in any society. His actions at the Aschendorfer Moor camp, driven by a combination of psychological factors and the unique circumstances of war, underscore the potential for ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary atrocities under certain conditions.